Welcome to the first episode of To Be Determined. In this episode, I start a conversation with Jason Liebig, where we talk about his childhood and then how that influenced his further choices in life and creative pursuits. So buckle up because he has a lot of great stories that I think you'll find interesting. I'm here with Jason Liebig.
Hi.
Collectingcandy.com is your website.
hmm
And why don't we start with a little bit of basic biography of you and what it is you do.
Yeah, I am at this point probably best known as a confectionery historian and pundit. I've published hundreds and hundreds of articles on the history of candy, candy brands. So I'm really into that aspect of our pop culture, and I've tried to really sort of expand the breadth of how that part of our pop culture is talked about and discussed and everything. And I have a background in pop culture stuff. I used to work in the comic book business, and that sort of guided me to around all these different places I'm at now. But yeah, so these days I talk about the history of candies, sometimes the history of junk food. Hosted a show on Cooking Channel for a hot second about all that stuff, which was a lot of fun. So those are the kinds of things I like to do. So that's essentially me. Yes.
So let's go back to childhood.
Okay.
What was your tell me where you grew up.
I grew up in Nebraska in the 70s primarily. Yeah.
Okay.
So
And I
I was a
mean
Midwestern kid.
small town or medium-sized town or city?
18,000 people, medium. So that's a small town. It's not a tiny Nebraska town. Some of those towns have like one street in Nebraska, but we were big enough to have a Woolworths when I was very, very young. That was there from like
Yeah.
the 20s. But then,
Okay.
which is definitely a place for me. But then toward like when I was 10 years old, we had like a Kmart. And then we would eventually, like when I was 13, we get a Walmart. And so it was that kind of town, you know.
So the Kmart they built the Kmart while you were a kid.
Oh yeah, yeah. Kmart was probably
Oh,
there
okay.
when I would say Kmart was probably in when I was like 6 years old. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, they built it when you were six. Okay.
yeah.
Um,
Thereabouts. Yeah.
how many grocery stores did you have in your town?
We had a lot of grocery stores because there were still, when I was growing up, there were still a lot of mom and pop shops. My childhood grocery store, there were two that I really identify with my childhood. One was an IGA, which a lot of people know around the country.
Okay.
The other one was a Midwestern grocery store, which I'm obsessed with because there are none left. It's called Jack and Jill. So
Jack and Jill with the two little kids?
yeah. Jack and Jill. Yeah.
Okay. I
So,
have what do I have? A matchbook on that?
oh, yeah,
I have a
probably.
couple I
Yeah,
have a
yeah,
couple
yeah.
little things on that.
I actually took one of the matchbooks and I blew it up and I made a T-shirt with it that I love. Because also the dots, the line screen on it blew up and it just looks so great as a T-shirt. I was like,
Oh
oh,
yeah.
it's born to me, like that. But so that's where
So
like Jack and Jill, there were two. There was a bigger one out by the highway, but down where my grandmother lived and where we lived for a while, there was just like maybe a 15-minute walk if you were walking, but like a 2-minute drive to the small Jack and Jill, where I did my early. I bought comic books there, candy
really?
cereal. Yeah, Grit. I bought Grit.
Grit magazine? You bought Grit magazine?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
For the
So,
stamp articles because I was a stamp collector.
okay.
It's all true. They had like really great little commemorative stamp features. Oh, it's a good thing I'm married. I will never get a date again after this.
Yeah, I'm gonna drag you through the
Good,
collecting mud. You're
good,
gonna
good,
yes. I'm gonna get things out of you that
good.
no one else would have ever
All right. My face
wanted or
turns
needed.
red. It's just hot in here.
I, it's funny because I only know Grit from the comic books where they
Oh
always were
yeah,
trying to get the kids
to
to
sell it.
sign up as
Yeah,
salesmen, which would go door to door to
yeah.
buy this little thing. I actually have I have like a newspaper bag for Grit,
Oh yeah, of
so
course.
so you could walk around,
Well, it
selling
was
your.
in the grocery store in Jack and Jill. They had their little newsstand right as you'd walk in, and it was like an old-fashioned newsstand. But then right next to that, where they racked all the magazines and newspapers, there was Grit. But then that Grit was like right next to where the spinner rack was for the comics.
So
So,
they
and of
did have a spinner.
course, oh
Okay.
yeah, they had one spinner rack. Yeah, and that's where they put their comics. Yeah, it's
And
pretty
how
cool.
much were comics? The first comics you remember buying? How much were they?
Probably 20 cents. Yeah,
Okay, so
yeah.
you were in at 20 cents. Okay.
Yeah, and someone was, I'm sure, buying them for me at that point. I don't know. or my brother was, because I had a brother who was 3 years older. So if anyone was handling money at that age, it would have been him. You know, they would have given him the money.
Now, did you
So
get an allowance that you spent, or you don't?
no, no, we were just you know, pampered, you know, lower middle class poor children, I think. So
So
they convinced.
money would just flow at random times,
I
or
think so, yeah. I mean, you know, we were from a single parent household. My mother was a single parent. She worked 2 jobs. And I was always convinced growing up that we were super spoiled. And then I found out later on that, and don't get me wrong, I felt spoiled, but I found out
yeah.
later on we were actually pretty poor. And I was like, oh, you totally tricked me.
Well, that's
It's
good.
great.
You
No, it's
you grew up
fantastic.
without, maybe not stigma, but just like
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
experiencing that as anything, because you kind of got generally what not generally what you wanted,
Oh,
but
yeah.
okay.
Like
So we have
I got the Evil Knievel stunt cycle, but then the kid down the street got like the, you know, the camper and everything else with this, you know, with the whole thing. And I was like, oh, so, but I played with him, so it was all good, you know. Yeah.
okay. So we got two grocery stores. You'd go there, you
Yeah.
buy comics, you buy your grit.
Yeah.
So what about liquor stores? Did you go to liquor stores and convenience stores, and
Um,
what was the
growing up, like at that age, until I was a teenager, we didn't really have convenience stores in my town at all. We had some liquor stores, but I
Mhm.
wasn't really going to liquor stores.
Sure.
There weren't any within a walk. What I had was, there was a store on the south, the old part of town, which was where we lived, the south side of the tracks. And actually maybe the north side. But anyway, I think it was the south side. Um, on 8th Street, which is an old street, just a residential street, but about probably, I don't know, 15 blocks down, there was a store called Swanson's, which was an old general store built into like what used to be a house and is now a house again, unfortunately. But
Oh
that
wow.
place was a general store from like the 20s. And we would go there. And that's probably my most, that and our Woolworths, which is on our little main street in town. But that Swanson store, I'm obsessed with like photos of it. You know, if any pop up, you know, it's like, and I've only seen like 1 or 2 that have popped up in like some Columbus, Nebraska Facebook group or what have you.
Oh, okay.
But I remember going there and everything was probably from the 30s and 40s. They had an old Coke refrigerated machine that you would go in and get, you know, the old
Yes.
ice cream machine that I would get push-ups and drumsticks out of. And they had a very old, probably like at that point, would have been like a 40-year-old candy, you know, display case, a glass display case and wooden, you know, that you would look through and pick out their candy and they would pull it out from behind. And hell, I think the guy, because it was also probably like a little, they made sandwiches in there. The guy always had like an apron on who worked there. You know, it was very Mayberry, that place, you know, so it was
So
fantastic.
is that where you bought a lot of candy as a kid?
Yes, that I'd say that for me, if we're talking about my old candy, it's got to be
Oh,
Swanson's General Store and Woolworths. And
oh,
Woolworths
Woolworths.
was,
Okay.
oh yeah, Woolworths was big.
And how did Woolworths have the candy out?
Woolworths. I mean, Woolworths. We had an old Woolworths that had been there again probably since the early 1900s. They had a
Single stories.
single story, yeah, single story on an old Main Street, which is still the old Main Street. Um, and it had a luncheonette, which I would go to as a kid.
Sure.
And you know, you would walk in. I still have dreams about it sometimes. Where, oh look, they reopened the Woolworths. Um, such a dork. So we go in, and there's like the checkout aisles, and they had like the old scale that you could get like your
Oh,
fortune out of, a paper fortune out of the
oh,
scale.
okay. Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
you
yeah,
like
yeah.
turn.
Wait, not yet. Okay.
Yeah, and so you'd walk and had the mirror on it. So a lot of, and there was I think what else was in the Woolworths that I loved? Oh, they had the photo machine, like your 4 strip
Oh,
photos in there.
sit in for $1
Yeah,
and
yeah,
instant.
yeah.
Okay.
So right behind there, though, almost the center aisle of the store, because I think they even had clothes in there. But then you would go right down. It was like the candy aisle, and I think it was only on one side, the candy. But then it was every candy, you know. So it was
Oh,
more candy than I'd ever see anywhere else. So it
oh.
was there.
So they would get like you'd see new things there.
Oh yeah, so like I'll never forget there was a knockoff of Fun Dip that Tops came out with called like Dip-a-Lock or something. It was like a key that was candy, and you dip it into this plastic lock that was filled with powder, and then you would lick
Okay.
that off of there. That's the first. I definitely remember getting that there. I remember getting a lot of stuff from like Tops and Fleer, all the novelty stuff. I remember getting pop bottle candy, which was basically like a clear hard candy, like a Jolly Rancher, but in the shape of sort of a bottle pop. So I got all sorts of candy at Woolworths for sure. Yeah.
And what about gum cards? Did you do gum cards or did you not
Oh,
pay any
yeah.
attention?
Yeah, no, I mean, when I was very young, I think the first, outside of comic books, I think the first thing like my older brother and I collected together or collected or bought or were obsessed with were wacky packages. So I
Okay.
was buying a lot of wacky packages in the early to mid 70s, or he was, and then I was playing with them. And we stuck wacky packages all over our bedroom closet doors, which was a point of parental contention. I'll never forget the day we had to like try to peel them all off when we were. It was very heartbreaking because I think we were
Well,
moving out.
that's how you and I met initially was you had some sort of trunk that you and your brother had
Oh
owned
yeah, that's
together or
right.
something and was covered in stickers and I remember you came I mean somehow we connected and you were
Yeah.
like I'm looking for this and this and I'm like oh what a bunch of and you were trying to just even figure out what a lot of them were.
No, I was trying to figure out what a lot of stuff was, and I had picked up your book, which had also sort of inspired. I'd picked up Crazy Kids Food. I was shooting a
Oh,
movie in
okay.
Boston, and I had this is the crazy thing. This is sort of the genesis of my story. Actually, directly ties back to you. I was up in Boston for 3 days shooting like an independent film, and I had a day off. And this is before smartphones, or I think even like a lot of Wi-Fi was going around. So this is like 15 years ago, 16 years ago. And God, no, this is like 17 years ago. So I spent a day. I went to the local Barnes and Noble because I didn't know anybody in Boston at the time, and I was just in the design section looking for books, and I found, oh, this looks fun, and I flipped through it, and I took it back to my hotel room, and I was immediately obsessed with. I didn't, I realized, oh my God, all this stuff is reminding me of all these things, and I would see like the old Hershey tin with the kid. I was like, oh, God, I haven't thought about that in years, and I think the genesis of me as a collector was I had Crazy Kids Food by Dan Goodsell and Steve Roden. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have a Super Sugar Crisp box from when I was a kid, a Hot
Okay.
Tamales box from when I was a kid, and a Marathon bar wrapper from when I was a kid. And it
So
took me
those were the
those,
three primary.
yeah.
Okay.
I was like, if I can get those three, I'll be good.
I'm assuming you have all three and you're good. So you're like
I have all
retired.
three, and I know, and I was not good. It's fun. It was funny too because it was actually it was a very big challenge to get like the. I think the Super Sugar Crisp was a little easier, but trying to find a Marathon bar wrapper or a Hot Tamales box from when I was a kid took so much time. If I was able to get them right away, I might have stopped. I don't know that I would have,
You wouldn't
but
have.
I probably wouldn't. No, it's already in me. So then, so yeah, once I went, but yes, so that's it. But I didn't get to talk about trading cards. But then I also collected after wacky packages. It was Star Wars cards. We collected baseball cards as a kid, and so like I was obsessed with Star Wars cards when they first came out. I remember the magic. We were on a family road trip vacation in the 70s. And I'll never forget stopping at some roadside gas station, and they had a new series of Star Wars cards.
Oh, because they
And
started with the blue and then it
they
was
started with the
yellow and
blue, and like the
orange and
wrappers. I'm trying to remember, like the first series wrapper was maybe green, but the cards were blue. The
oh, is
second
that what it
series
was?
wrapper, and then I just remember walking into the store, and there's that sort of magic of seeing something you love, but it's a little different. And
Sure.
I was obsessed, and I was like, oh my God, they changed the border. I think it was the first time I'd ever realized they would change something like that. And so I became obsessed with Star Wars cards. But I was still a pretty young kid, and by the time Empire came out, my brother was a young teenager, and I still wasn't a teenager yet, but I remember we actively collected those like we were young hobbyists. Like we were
Okay.
we would collect multiple sets of Empire cards. We were taking whatever money we'd made from our whatever paper routes and just buying shit. So yeah, it was wild.
So now you have something interesting to me is you saved everything from your childhood like that's fairly collectible?
No, I mean, I did. The
'Cause
funny thing is, I didn't save candy when I was a kid at all. I didn't save any of my
well,
candy
yeah,
packaging.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean things like
Um,
the Star Wars cards,
oh
you saved
yeah.
all of that.
Like I still have we still have all of our childhood Star Wars cards. We have a lot of our baseball cards. Like I think we got a lot of stuff like robbed from like someone was doing housework and they took a bunch of our baseball cards in the early '80s or something,
Oh
which
wow.
was a
Okay.
bummer. But it's a long. It was like happened like 30 years ago. But we still have all of our Star Wars cards. We still have like I recently came upon like these Empire sets that I think after we put a set of 132 cards together, we wrapped them in like wax paper or something and put tape on them. Because they weren't collector supplies, at the time. So we like had them all like nicely put together. But yeah, all the toys I had as a kid, all the Star Wars figures. Still have my original Darth Vader case. Still have my original the little vinyl cases with the Star Wars. We've got most of our Hot Wheels toys. Our Hot Wheels cars, the die cast. I mean, some of them didn't survive, and most of our all of our childhood GI Joes, the big 12-inch GI Joes from the 70s, they all sort of died in battle.
Oh, okay. It's just
Yeah.
just a pile of parts left.
Yeah, like that. Like if they survived 4th of July, it was a miracle. So yeah.
Oh,
But things like the Star
okay.
Wars figures, by that time we weren't trying to blow up all of our toys, so we still have all those. Yeah, there was we had what I thought was a massive Star Wars collection at the time,
Yeah.
which could fit in like a little Foot Locker. I because you grew up in a small town in Nebraska, you think, well, I've gotten everything I've ever seen with Star Wars written on it. And then you find out later on, no, there was a billion other things made. Like that Steve Sansweet collector's book on Star Wars stuff is ridiculous. I remember when his first book came out. Forget about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not a category you want to go into.
Oh,
It's not a category for the faint of heart.
God, not now. I mean,
Star Wars.
I mean, just so it's funny to see how like Star Wars material, like Star Wars action figures, were sort of along with everything else. If you want to look like movie posters or whatever, they weren't extra special necessarily. I mean, they were certainly more collectible. I remember when I first started looking at toys in the 90s again as an adult or as an older collector. But now some of those Star Wars figures, they're so valuable. They sell for so much money. There's so many people with big bucks, I think, competing for them.
Now we were talking the other day, and you told me a story which you're gonna have to retell on here because it's so interesting about the vinyl Cape Jawa.
Oh,
if you don't, if you're not a collector, there's this variation to the Jawa figure. Yeah. Most of us had the Jawa figure that had a little cloth outfit,
a little hood.
Mm-hmm. But there's also one which probably was the very first one that had a little cape cut out of vinyl. So it looked really cheap. And tell me about your experience.
So, I didn't realize, of course, in the 90s is when action figure collecting became very mainstream. It's when I became an action figure collector after Tomart's Action Figure Digest did this big, beautiful hardcover. And I became obsessed. So I was going back and looking at my Star Wars figures, learning about the vinyl cape. But then, of course, I remembered because I had remembered the vinyl cape Jawa from my own youth, not because I had one, but because I remember going, it might have been Kmart, but we also had an Alco Duckwall store, which is basically a Kmart type store.
Okay.
Alco. So but I think it was Kmart. I was in Kmart, and I remember seeing the Jawa with the vinyl cape. I picked it up, and I remember showing it to my brother, and I was like, well, this is terrible. And I think they had both on the shelf at the time. So I'm looking at both of these, and I was like, well, this one looks awesome. He's got the hood. It's a different piece of cloth. And this one, he's just got this stupid piece of cut vinyl. It's terrible. It's ugly, And so of course I chose the cloth caped Jawa. Now I wouldn't have kept the vinyl cape Jawa, but I think if you had a vinyl cape Jawa, like the one I pulled off the store shelf now in that package, what is like $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 or some crazy amount. I think they go for possibly $10,000 or more. I don't know. They're crazy.
Yeah, I just saw someone, they had to raise some money, in all this stuff, and they sold their Luke telescoping. And I don't know what the number was, but just the loose one had some crazy thousands of dollars.
It's wild to see that. It's wild to see what Star Wars action figure collecting has become, because it's really, I remember as a kid, my grandmother telling me, well, take care of those Star Wars figures. They're going to be worth money someday. And I remember I was collecting baseball cards. Like, these things are never, like, everybody's got these things. But you see now, that was the real shocker to me, I think, over the last 10 years, was how loose vintage Star Wars figures are actually. Some of those things can sell for, even not the rare ones, can sell for $30, $40 a figure. And I was like, wow, that's
crazy.
No, it's interesting.
You could have filled your house with that stuff if you just started whenever.
Sure. Yeah. My God.
Okay. Let's go back to Kmart. Then let's talk about that other store, which I've never heard of. What was your sort of experience with Kmart?
I mean, I remember it was a place we would occasionally go to get school clothes because it was cheap.
Sure.
And I remember getting my knockoff Adidas there. I think they were called Kmart Trax shoes, TRAXX, maybe that was their brand. And I remember I had because they were blue and the suede, and they had the 3 lines, or maybe they had 4 lines to not violate, trademark or whatever. Sure. But then, going there, I remember I was obsessed with the toys, of course. That's what I loved. And at that point, there were still Migos, there was still Big Jim.
Big Jim, sure.
I never had, what was this stuff that Jack Kirby designed? Was it called Fist? Or no, the Action Pack, I think. Big Jim's Action Pack.
Yeah.
I remember being obsessed with Big Jim's Action Pack because it had this great Jack Kirby art on the packaging. And the figures had these great, like, they had these great accessories, and they could do all these weird things. And I'll never forget, one of them had this silver, plastic molded silver, like, armband thing that could pop open and have, like, a screen and stuff, that he could talk back to the pack with, I guess. So I was obsessed with all these things. And I feel like I traded someone for that accessory. So, like, my Mego Spider-Man may have worn that at some point, or I may have even got it under one of my 12-inch G.I. Joes. I don't know. But so Kmart, I most identify with Star Wars action figures because I'll never forget, begging my mom to take me out to buy me a new figure or something, and trying to get her to go out there and, like, having probably a temper tantrum or something until, she gave in to my insane, bawling, please buy me Star Wars toy.
Now, did you ever own any of the vehicles or any of the bigger stuff?
I think I do remember for Christmas, my brother and I each got a vehicle, and those came out of either the JCPenney Christmas catalog or the Sears Christmas catalog.
Sure.
And I got an X-wing. I got an X-wing with a little, that you could push R2 down. And I think it would make the sound, or that would pop out the wings. And there was a button to make the sound. Sure. And then he got the TIE Fighter with the pop-off wings. And then later on, he got the Imperial Carrier, that, like, this little gray vehicle that you could put the characters in, but it had the voices. You could push the different voices.
Oh, okay.
And they actually just made that a canon vehicle on The Mandalorian, I think. So that's a deep cut geek thing, but it's just like, oh, they actually took the Imperial transport and they made it real. So, yeah. So, and I think finally, I was a very lucky boy when Christmas. I got a Millennium Falcon. I got one of the Millennium Falcons.
You did get the big Millennium Falcon.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think we still have that somewhere, but it's incomplete. I mean, there's so many pieces. Like, I had that I would play with that with was it Milton Bradley Starbird, which was one of the best electronic toys ever.
Yes.
Because you could take it apart and make a shorter version, so you could construct it a little bit, but it also had the whirring sound in it. So you would turn it on, it would make that brrr, and if you leaned it back like this, it would start to increase. So it sounded like it was going faster. It was mind-blowing technology at the time. I had a big track. We each had a big track, which we had a lot of fun with.
Oh, the big track. Yeah.
And it had the little strobe blaster, and you could put the little carrier onto it. And of course, they were going to come out with all these extra things they never did. Attachments.
Yes. And now you mentioned another store in this Kmart, what was it called?
Alco. Yeah. And Alco Duckwall. Yeah, it was like a sub-name.
Is that like a regional store? Or
that was. I think there were still a few around a few years ago. I think they were bought out by another regional store called Pomida, which we had the very first retail store like that in our town. We had in Nebraska was called Tempo. And that was a sort of Midwestern chain. I think that went maybe as east as Illinois or something.
I've heard of Tempo, yeah.
And then when Tempo went out of business in our town, that's when Pomida came into that spot. But I think Pomida's, some of the last Alcos in Nebraska became Pomida's. But Alco Duckwall, like, one of my favorite things, not to jump ahead, but one of my favorite things for old candy packaging is try to get private label things. And I have an Alco Duckwall chocolate bar wrapper, which is one of my favorite oddball things.
That would have been 80s or 70s.
It was probably like that. I'm thinking the one I have is probably early 80s.
Yeah.
So
80s, kind of a weird period.
Yeah, so I remember seeing things like, I do remember before even, I think one of the first things I talked to you about, I was trying to find the troglodytes, the Pangburns troglodytes candy packaging with that could change the things. And I was looking for one called Grass Chopper, which I remembered from when I was a kid, but I had this very, very vague memory from going into Tempo and in their weird candy section, which I don't really recall too much, but I remember this. I remember picking this up, and that idea Grass Chopper stuck in my head. The visual I had for it in my head was completely wrong when I finally found it again and realized, I remembered it totally differently, but yeah. So I have a vague candy memory of Tempo, and I also remember, I think I might have told you before, going in and seeing like the giant size Star Wars figures, the original Kenners, and I saw like an IG-88, which became, of course, a big collectible piece. But I remember thinking, that's the dumbest toy I've ever seen. He's just a tall, like, slender, boring robot. What does he do? He does this, It's like, doesn't even have a face. I was such a critical kid for dumb toys, which now, like everything that was valuable, I was like, that sucks.
Well, and I mean that's why all those ones are valuable is
Of
because they're the
course.
ones that nobody bought
Yeah.
because they didn't, you know,
Yeah.
you wanted the Boba Fett. I remember
Oh,
getting the
yeah.
Boba Fett and being so annoyed that the rocket didn't shoot. It's just like, you know, it's just
When I
I couldn't
remember
believe it.
finding them and seeing the stickers they'd put over the packages covering up the rocket fire. And I was like, wait a second. And I tried to order it right away because I said, maybe I can get it in before they stop doing the rockets because I want those rockets. And no, Boba Fett. That was lame. It was terrible.
Disappointment. Such
Very
a level of
much. Very
disappointment.
much.
So so you had all of these obsessions as a
Yeah.
kid.
Yeah.
Um and then like you said my book sort of reawakened that stuff. But
Yeah.
like is what's the kind of thread that gets us to where you are now?
Um,
Um,
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the collector thread, I was always a collector at a pretty young age. I
mm,
liked gathering things. I like sorting them out. I like having multiple versions of things to look at, and sort of organize, right? It was maybe some kind of OCD thing. Um, and then, of course, as a comic book fan, I love the stories, but I love collecting them, and as these hobbies became established, you sort of got interested in that too. It's like, oh, there's a hobby. People care about these things I care about, and then you're learning about things that came before you and everything else. Um, and then I stopped collecting for a little bit, and then I got back into different kinds of collecting. But
what age did you stop, and what was there an impetus for getting back in that you remember?
I think I think it was probably. I mean, it was probably becoming. I'd say around the age of like 12 or 13. I wasn't collecting really baseball cards
Hmm.
anymore. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons with my friends, so that became an obsession. So I was buying modules and
So you
books. I
start
was like,
buying
oh,
modules.
yeah, latest. And of course, we have every module that we ever bought and every issue of Dragon magazine. And
What
then,
what what year did you start D&D, and
I
what's
think
your primary?
I started playing regularly D&D probably around 83. Yeah. And we
And
played
what
with my brother who tended to be our dungeon master and a group of like 5 or 6 of our friends. And,
and
you know,
83, what you'd have that have been just the three hardbacks? You'd be the big
yeah,
Dungeon
that would have
Master
been,
guide, the
that was
big Monster
second
Manual,
edition. Second
second
edition.
edition. Okay.
Um, Dungeon Master's Guide, Player's Handbook, and Fiend Folio came out around then. Right
So
around there,
you
after the
remember
Monster Manual.
you
Oh
remember
yeah,
Fiend Folio coming out.
sure, yeah, yeah. First edition Fiend Folio, which had the unlicensed characters they got from like the Michael Moorcock stuff, which I think they took out later. Um,
Yes.
so yeah, so that stuff, and then we played that. Like that was an obsession. I never really stopped collecting comic books during that time,
Okay.
but during that time, I was saving the comic books, but I don't know that I was an active collector. I mean, I don't know that I ever stopped really collecting comic books because it was becoming so much more organized. Like I remember on a family vacation, we were in Denver. I wanted to go to Mile High Comics, so I
Oh,
was like
okay. Wow.
still looking through
Yes.
all their stuff. Um, but that was just, you wanted to read the stories. And at that point, it's like you got your first summer job working farm work in the summer or whatever. You could go into a comic store with like $80 and walk out with a pile of comics that was this high. And there was 2 stores that we would go to in Omaha, Nebraska. We would go to a place called Dragon's Lair, which is fantastic. It might still be around. And there was a sci-fi place called Star Realm, which was fantastic. It was like a science fiction comic book store.
Okay.
These were magical places, but we could only go to them a couple of times a year because there was nothing like that. There were no comic stores in my hometown growing up. So
So so so
yes,
you were still buying newsstand. You were buying your basic comics off newsstand
yeah,
into into your teens or
yeah,
whatever,
for sure.
and
Yeah.
then occasional. And did you? How far back did you ever go in comics when you started collecting more?
Oh, I think there were some people in our hometown that we'd trade with or whatever. I remember we got stuff from the '60s. Like I traded for a
Okay.
guy, and he may have even given me the things. I had like a complete run of Captain Marvel, the Marvel series,
The
not the
Yeah, yeah,
Fawcett, but the Marvel. Now it's
sure.
everyone knows who Captain Marvel is now. She's but yeah, but it was, and we were trying to put together, I think, probably throughout some of the early years of the '80s. Like I think we were trying to put together like a nice run of John Byrne's X-Men, so there were those types of things. So you're sort of getting into the hobby of it. because there were the ads in the comics. Mile High had an ad in there. And so you could order things from there. I remember ordering, God, what did I order off of there? I remember like at one time in my newsstand at Jack and Jill, there was an issue of Captain Canuck, the Canadian series. And I was like, oh, the artwork is so cool and different. And
how did that end up? That's very strange.
Well, I thought so too. You know, how did that end up at a grocery store in Nebraska, in small town Nebraska? But it did. And of course, it seemed so exotic.
Sure.
So I picked that up. And it's funny, thinking about comic books now, I thought about something I haven't thought about in forever. The only place I ever saw Charlton books was
I was thinking of Charlton too when you said the Captain Canuck.
The only place I ever saw Charlton was in Woolworths. And like I think they had like a little comic book area, maybe in one of their toy aisles, or in the toy aisle and back. And so they didn't have a spinner rack at our Woolworths, but there was like, I'll never forget finding the Charltons. And I always thought they were really cheap comics. And I'm sure I bought some, like maybe some of the monster ones or what have you.
I had like one issue of E-Man,
which
was always like this really, in all my thousands of comics, was always like this weird outlier. I think it was Joe Stanton artwork, and it just was like, it's like his first work, I think.
Wow. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of guys got their start at Charlton's.
It stood as like a very weird, like, what the heck is this?
Yeah. Now, I haven't actually thought, I got it. The idea that I was only buying Charlton, I don't think I've got, this is interesting because I probably haven't thought about that in like 30 years, like the idea that I remember getting Charlton comics at Woolworths and never seen them anywhere else, It's just like, wow.
So since we're on comics, let's get to your the height of your comic book career. No, well,
sure.
Let's talk about that. Because you have a very interesting sort of affiliation with the comic world.
Yeah, I went to college in Lincoln, Nebraska, and this was like the late 80s, early 90s. So comic books as a hobby, as a sort of almost cultural phenomenon or fad or whatever you want to call it, has exploded. This is all post Watchmen, post Dark Knight, post Killing Joke, So these were just in those few years after that where these seemed like the most exciting things ever. And so I would say my last few years in college, I started going to a local store there called Cosmic Comics. I became friends with the owner, and I was reading things like Sandman at that point, expanding past like X-Men and X-Force, which I still also loved. And, so I was reading more things. It was a very exciting thing. And I was like trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Because like, I wasn't that sure of what I wanted to do.
Wait, what did you go to school for?
I think I started in education. Like I was really interested in like music. I was like, maybe I could become a music educator. And that lasted about a semester when I realized how hard it was to be a teacher. I sort of had, I think I had the introduction or the fundamentals of education teacher who's there to weed out all the people who don't have the freaking mettle to be a public teacher, because it's really hard. And I think it's way harder now, but back then in like 1990, it was hard enough, And I realized, oh God, no, that's miserable. That's a miserable job for me. But then I came up with this fantasy that, maybe I'll work at a comic book store and open my own comic book store one day. And then the fantasy became, and the funny thing was, I was this close to taking a managerial job at my friend who owned Cosmic Comics. I was this close to graduating and taking on the managerial position of his new store, his flagship store that he was opening. He had 4 stores in Nebraska. That was his 4th. And about 6 months before graduation, because we've been talking about 5 months before graduation, one of his part-timers who had been there years said, and this is funny because this changed the entire direction of my life. He said, my guy, I think his name is Lauren, he's having a kid and he wants to go full-time, so I got to give him the managerial job. And I'm sorry, but he's been with me for 7 years. I was like, no, I understand. He goes, but maybe you get a job at Marvel Comics when you graduate. Or, I was like, okay.
He said that out of the blue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like it was one of those things where I don't know, and it's hard for me to remember exactly what I was thinking. It didn't necessarily seem possible. And so because I didn't know anybody who'd done any of that. So he said, well, listen, I'm going. He was part of something called the RRP, which was a retailer program. He was a cool guy. He knew, he was a good retailer, very savvy. He had a great personality, he was a gregarious personality. So he was part of this group of like 15 retailers around the country that DC would fly in for special events, and they would use them as like market research and retailer research. So he knew he had great relationships with a lot of people. He encouraged me to go to Comic-Con in Chicago Comic-Con in
Chicago.
1993. I went.
Okay.
He introduced me to Marvel and DC people, and those were the initial introductions that didn't necessarily go anywhere right away. Then I flew out to New York in October to try to follow up with Marvel, and he
Just
sort of
on
on
your
my
own
own. Yeah, this
dime.
is
You
on my
just
own
were
dime.
like
Yeah,
you didn't have a meeting. You had nothing. You
I had
just
no meetings. I had some
got on
phone
a plane.
numbers, and I had called and I said, "Listen, I'm going to try to be out." I had met with Sven Larson in Chicago,
Who's
and
who's
Sven
Sven?
was like a direct marketing. He might have been the director of marketing for Marvel at the time, or director of retail comic book store marketing. Um, he took me out to lunch at Chicago Comic Con, and then he's like, "Well, if you come to New York, we'll set up a
Look
thing."
me up.
And I think I met a lovely woman named Sharon Katua at DC Comics, and she worked in like custom products. Like she was one of the people who did the original Sandman statue that they did, that Randy Bowen sculpted. And she was lovely, and she encouraged me. And so I came to New York and managed to get a walkthrough with Sven's assistant. Sven might have been away or something, Sven Larson at Marvel. So he's walking me through Marvel and just showing me around. And of course, I was wide-eyed and just trying to see things, but I didn't know what I was looking at, seeing the bullpen or what have you.
So the bullpen is still there.
Well,
Are
yeah, no,
people
yeah, for
work? I
sure.
mean, at that point, and there are
Yeah.
people that work in the bullpen every
Oh
day.
yeah, I think in '93, yeah, there was the bullpen was right there. Editorial row was on one side, the bullpen was right there. There were a couple of production offices on the side, but yeah, so you had a lot of people who'd come out of SVA and Joe Kubert School who do art corrections, some lettering. At that point, it was just the beginning of doing a lot of digital cover layouts. So there was a guy in there who, when I eventually worked there a few years later, was doing like our cover layouts digitally, laying on the logos for X-Men or what have you. So I remember going there and thinking, oh, wow, this is really cool. But I didn't get like, it wasn't like a strong invitation
Sure.
and I can't remember that guy's name because he ended up leaving shortly after that. But I went over to DC. They were very nice. And a woman named Ann Ivan, who was the head of their retail representative program. And then Bob Wayne, who's the director of marketing. I think he eventually became a VP of marketing over there. They gave me, I may have met him, but I sat down with her. We talked for a little bit. She was very encouraging. But no, and I did meet Bob Wayne because Bob Wayne said, well, listen, we're planning on adding a couple of jobs this fall or, in the coming months. And, send us your resume when you get home and, we'll look at it. Okay. So, and I'll try to compress this story because it's a long story. But so I get back to Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm working at this point. I've graduated.
So
Yes.
how did you feel about the situation when you came home?
Oh,
You
I was
were
excited.
optimistic. Okay.
I was inspired. Life was very magical and scary, but the fact that I got to sit in those rooms and like they took me into a conference room at DC Comics, which was in like a series of Warner Brothers floors that had like a big Michael Keaton Batman costume on, some mannequin or whatever, a Michelle Pfeiffer Catwoman costume, and there's like a super like a Clark Kent sitting on the table or something. It was so like Disneylandish. It was like, and it was so, oh my God, wouldn't that be amazing if? And so at this point I was like, maybe I can do this. And so thank God I was so like, I felt like I was so much braver then or bolder then than I am now. So I started, like I sent off my resume. I didn't hear from anybody at DC Comics. I didn't have an invitation to send my resume to Marvel. So I didn't hear back from anyone at DC. So I called because that's all you could do then, right? You could either write a letter or you could call. And I'll never forget because Bob Wayne, who at that point was their director of marketing, had given me his phone number, or maybe I called the switchboard and asked for him. Who knows what I did? But I started calling. I went there in late October. I started calling through November. I might have stopped for the holidays. In like January, I was still calling. I probably called once every couple of weeks. And I'll never forget, I always tell people this story. I said, listen, if you want to hear a story about where my life could have gone one or two directions, I remember sitting there staring at the phone like I was calling up trying to ask a girl out to prom. And I would sit there for 10 minutes, picking up the phone, putting it down, picking it up, putting it down, because I was terrified.
Sure.
That this was going to be the call where they say, you know what, we got your mess. Please stop calling.
Got it. Now wait, so were you talking to someone each time you called?
I was not talking to anyone. I was leaving voicemails.
So you just leave a voicemail.
Yeah. So
throwing it out there in the ether.
Yeah.
Hey,
and I
it's
was
me
polite.
again.
And so I think in February, like it was a couple of weeks from my birthday or whatever, I called in February. I'll never forget the message I left because I was like, listen, Bob, this is Jason Liebig again. I realized by now the 2 jobs you talked about when I was there in October have been filled. And I just wanted to let you know, and at this point I'd made a decision. I'm thinking about moving out in the next few months to New York. I'm going to just get a job. And I wanted to see if I could ask you what I could, this is so much like out of like a movie. What can I do for the next year to make sure when you hire somebody a year from now, I might be the guy you would hire? And that was my voicemail that I left, and still didn't hear back. And then I think I called again, maybe in March, and I got through to him. Like, he answered, and he was like, yeah, he was like, and Bob's very gruff. He's a funny guy, but he's very gruff. And he goes, oh, I got your voicemails. Like, and I'm sure it was a joke around the office. This kid keeps calling, right? This stupid kid from Nebraska keeps calling. He goes, I got your voicemails. He goes, first, he goes, we haven't filled the jobs. You know, the jobs have not been filled. He goes, I was actually in the hospital with, you know, some issues. So he says, yeah. So if you're moving out, give us a call when you move out. I was like, okay.
Okay.
And at this point, because when I went there in October to try to interview the first time, I think I was there about 10 days. I went there out with a buddy. I went out with a buddy, convinced a buddy of mine to go out and party it up in New York. Like, the last 3 days I was there, my mother had somehow tracked down her second cousin who had a daughter out there who was a few years older than me. And I stayed in the youth hostel on the Upper West Side my first week, $15 a night or whatever it was. So, so I get that. So anyway, when I moved out in April, I sold my little car. I had like a 69 Bug that I had worked on, sold my car, moved out, moved in with her because they needed a roommate. And so I moved in with her, which was great. And then I called up Ann Ivan, and we set up an interview. Great. I went out to, maybe she took me out to lunch. And then I went, that was on like a Monday or Tuesday. And then I got brought back in to meet with Bob Wayne again in this big conference room, this glorious conference room I had been in. And I'll never forget how it ended, because you asked me, how did I walk away from things? At the end of that interview, which was probably like an hour interview, and it's very intimidating. You're at this big conference room table, you're sitting there, and I'm just like, yeah. Because I had my little, my 22-year-old suit and tie, that I got at JCPenney or wherever I got it. And at the end of the interview, they gave me what sounded to me like a rejection letter.
Oh.
So Ann Ivan's walking me out by this big, like, chrome Warner Brothers shield right next to the elevator. And she's like, so I just want you to know that, no matter what happens, we've obviously seriously considered you. We think you're a great candidate. But once we really have seriously considered you. And I was like, okay, great.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I was like, and I went downstairs and I walked through the city a little bit. It was hot and whatever. I felt a little like, I don't think that went well. So that was probably on a Thursday or Friday. And I think it was the following Monday or Tuesday, I got a call from Ann, and she goes, hey, Jason, how are you? And I said, I'm really good. How are you? And she goes, good. And this is what she said. She goes, I got some good news for you. You're in. And I was like, and she goes, so I want you to come in a few days after that. Like, we didn't talk salary. We didn't talk anything. It was like, none of that shit mattered. Right. I was just like, and it was crazy. I remember I lived at this crazy warehouse loft with these girls. And I remember running laps in the warehouse loft because I was so over the moon excited. And that was my start. And that was my first professional job, after college. And then I would leave that after a year and a half probably. But I was working all the conventions, making friends with a lot of people in the business. And I freelanced for a year because I ended up picking up some like freelance copywriting work. And then I had friends at Marvel. This was during Marvolution. They were laying off lots of people. But I decided at that point I wanted to work in editorial if I was going to work. I wanted to work in the storytelling part of the business. And I didn't think there were going to be any opportunities because I saw what was happening. Jobs were getting slashed left and right because this was, I want to say, 94. But I got a call from a friend of mine, John Dokes, who was a marketing guy at Marvel. And we'd become friends working the conventions.
So these are all people. And what conventions were you working?
Well, the great thing was, as a marketing guy for DC Comics, I went to every convention they went to. So in the span of like a year and a half, I went to San Diego twice. I went to Chicago Comic-Con, Detroit Motor City Comic-Con, Dragon Con, every Comic-Con that they would attend, I was at, helping set up the booth, helping build the booth. I had like a headset, managing lines for autographs and all that stuff. I would help with the talent, take care of them. So I got to meet a lot of talent. I got to meet a lot of editors. Certainly I became friends working in the office. I became friends like one of the first weeks I was there. I'll never forget. I go out. one of the other marketing people who was friends with that editor said, "Hey, you want to come out? We're going for drinks every Wednesday night. Do you want to come out to this little Irish pub?" And I said, "Sure." So I go down, and I'll never forget, I was sitting across from Mike Carlin, Archie Goodwin. Of course, I was obsessed with Archie Goodwin. I was like, "Are you kidding me?" And some of my favorite memories, because this was only a few years before Archie passed away, he was one of the best people ever, Archie Goodwin. And the stories he told were insane. I'll never forget one Thanksgiving Eve, like we all stayed late at the office and we went out, and that Wednesday, and we went out, and it was just like Archie and myself and like two other people sitting around this table, like at 10 o'clock at night, talking about comics. Archie was telling stories of the old days. And it was just, I wish I could bottle up those memories, and like just pour them into my brain again, because they were incredible. But yeah, so jumping ahead a little bit, I heard, and this was probably one of the greatest professional things that ever happened to me. John Dokes calls me. They're looking for people in editorial. He'd actually gotten me an interview with their catalog department, because I was doing a lot of freelance copywriting. That never went anywhere, but then he called me back. I'll never forget. I thought I was going to go in meeting with someone from Human Resources for my first interview or whatever. I walk in, and it's an interview with their editor-in-chief, who was Bob Harris at the time.
Okay.
And he said, "Listen, it's, we talked about things. We talked about what I liked. We talked about my experience, who I knew, what I had done. It wasn't a lot at that point. But he asked me two questions, which were, again, maybe the boldest things I'd ever done at that point. He asked me, what do you think is a good comic? What do you think is a bad comic? And can you give me an example?"
Okay. This is 95, 96?
This is like early 95, I think.
Okay. And your answer, please.
My answer was, I said, well, there was this really great story I read that Mark Waid wrote on like DC Comics Presents or whatever it was, or one of the Superman analogy ones, or one of the Superman books. But it was a one-off story where a kid, if I can recall, a kid who was mentally ill, but it was obsessed with Superman, right?
Okay.
Somehow someone had thrown Superman's mind into that kid's body, right? So Superman is now stuck in this kid who everyone knows is crazy and obsessed with Superman. And then he's got to stop. And I can't remember even what happened to Superman's body in that story. But I said, Superman's such a tough character, because he can push planets around and you can't hurt him. So the stories are all about, well, we got to come up with someone else who's really powerful, or someone who has kryptonite or what have you. And I said, I thought this was such a great story because it put Clark in this position that, he had to protect this kid, but he also had to stop these bad things from happening. But he couldn't put this kid in danger. I said it was such a great conflict for the character. And I thought it really explored who Clark is as a character and what's important to him in a very different way, in a way you don't expect to see. And I said that was really wonderful. And Bob was like, okay. And I said, okay, and let me see, what's a bad comic? Now, at this point, they were doing a thing. Of course, he was a guy who had just recently become the editor-in-chief after leading the X-Men group for many years. He had just done Age of Apocalypse, which was like the best-selling miniseries. Of course, he presided over X-Men #1, with like 8 million copies, whatever, all this stuff. So Bob was a bit of a hotshot, I guess, at the time for 90s comics. They made him editor-in-chief. Anyway, so in the X-Men, which he was still overseeing, they were starting a thing called Onslaught. And Onslaught was a thing that would ultimately end up spinning off into Heroes Reborn, but that's not important. What the sort of rumor, and I think at this point it was only a rumor, it was a rumor you're going to turn Professor X into this big bad, right? You're going to turn him into a villain, which is what they did. Like some childhood trauma or whatever, turned him into Onslaught and this big bad. I'll never forget, and I'm talking to the guy who's in charge of these stories, and I said, listen, I think a bad comic, I said, look, I said, you guys are doing a thing called Onslaught. And I don't know why would I say this, right? But this is exactly what I said. I said, you're doing a thing called Onslaught right now. And it's like you're taking your hero and you're making him bad. And he's this big, weird costume and everything. I'll be honest. I go, my first impression of it, they're just doing what DC did with Parallax, with turning Hal Jordan into this big bad, right? Which they just did like a year ago. And I go, and that was kind of lousy then. And this looks lousy to me now. It doesn't look interesting. Right.
So you're coming from DC sort of, and you're praising DC, and you're telling Marvel
I sort of trashed DC as well. I trashed the Parallax story. I said it wasn't that great of a story, and I said this thing just seems like a bad version of a bad story. And it was quiet. And he's sitting there, and he's like, because that was my first impression too, right? So I was like, okay, all right. And at some point he said, look, we've had a lot of bad things happen in editorial here. There've been a lot of corporate changes. People have lost their jobs. People are shell shocked. I'm looking for someone with fire who's going to bring a lot of excitement and fire. And I was like, I can bring excitement and fire. I had no idea what I was talking about. But yeah, so then he had me come in. I got called back in to meet with Mark Powers, who at that point was taking over the lead on the X-Men books. Mark is still a close friend of mine here 25 years later or whatever it is. We met. We got along really well. I was replacing a guy named Ben Rabb, who was probably Bob's one of his favorite assistants ever. And Ben was great. I may have met Ben then, but I met them. And like 5 or 6 days later, I get a call that's like, oh, you're going to work on the X-Men. And I was like, are you kidding me? Because I was a huge X-Men fan. The joy that I felt, just the sheer unbelievableness of it. I just couldn't believe how lucky I was. It was so unreal and unbearably good. It was hard to imagine, and it was a hell of a run through a lot of chaos.
Sorry to cut Jason off, but there's a lot more to that story, which we'll be getting to in our next episode. So if you enjoyed this one, come on back and watch episode 2 of To Be Determined with part 2 of Jason Liebig's interview. Thanks a bunch.